fosters more subtly through social norms and shared behaviours that amount to collective notion of this is how we do things around here. Okay, now, so for example, I sat on a committee with Joe and several others where we looked at what are the principles for GISC around selection people. And eventually what we decided was that there was a principle at stake here, which was of people stepping forward, that people got selected out of a mutual energy, a mutual engagement. For that to happen, it couldn't be one-sided. We weren't going to select by going chasing. We were going to some extent, see who emerged and what emerged. So stepping forward became a kind of principle. When there was later consideration given, and it still is, to how we develop people, this principle of stepping forward retains its relevance. It is one of the principles people are using when they think about development, differentiating it from big corporately led processes of grabbing hold of people and developing them. So I'm using this as an example. This idea, in a sense, because it then gets taken up and in a sense slightly forecloses what then happens in the future, is an example of how things become sedimented and instituted. In some organisations it would be turned into a written policy. I don't think that's happened with us. I think it's more likely that it becomes a sort of practice that gets taken up organisationally. And in this sense, it doesn't matter who thought of it really. It just matters that it happened. Okay? By this reading, organising becomes impersonal, historic and culturally embedded, a force that shapes the behaviour of organisational actors from the background. It feeds or invests the ground of the organisation. Now, this way of thinking informed the childcare case. Some of my exchanges on that committee with Joe and with others made me think when I was actually getting ready for the childcare case. The essential aspects of that case were that it involved a breakdown in relationship between doctors, a separate service of health visitors, and the administrative arm of the NHS, the local primary care trust. The breakdown was subject to a structuralist or grounded analysis. Each part of the childcare system was found to be blaming the other two parts for a decline in the quality of care. Blame was related to a less obvious self-righteousness. That was a connection that got made, that characterised the identity of each of the parts, which was even less obviously related to an underlying idealism that was connected to the founding tradition of the NHS. We discussed this at length on Loddy 3. So, what then we noticed was that the point about this type of structural analysis is that it doesn't depend on deliberate decisions being made by organisational actors to blame or do anything else. It sets out deliberately not to blame the present incumbents. Rather, it is held that the relationship of meaning was operating as an underlying pattern, shaping the disposition of the doctors, the health visitors and the administrators as a set of cultural norms operating from the ground. Now, the structural analysis led on to an experiment with using feeling and intuition to detect the patterning habits and norms, seeking to fashion a direct connection to the effective atmosphere of the organisation. This was an attempt to reverse the direction of sedimentation and institution, to bridge a third-person structural analysis, a grounded analysis, to an effective first-person inquiry based on the immediacy of present contact. It was dependent on the consultant, me, developing a set of skills that were unusual in a consulting environment, experimenting with different types of skills. These unusual consulting skills included ones of being available and receptive to being there, sharing organisational experiences with the clients. In this way, the approach relied on passive surrender as well as more active processes of interrogation, being receptive to the incoming vibration. It was an experiment with feeling a way into system contact, seeking to vibrate in sympathy to an underlying pattern that was embedded in the ground of this organisation. Now, another aspect we talked about in Lottie 3, about the childcare case, which is relevant to ground, was the relational aspect. In my analysis of the disruption to overall purpose, blame and self-righteousness have become embedded in particular ways of structuring relationships. Relations are strongly shaped by the fundamental desire of human beings to influence others and the necessity of allowing oneself to be influenced. You may recognize that. These are relations of power. They're relations of power in relationship. It's a normal and ever-present feature of human interaction, necessary for there to be any social being in the first place, because without mutual influence, there would be no society. But fluid relations of power, instead of being variable and allowing different partners a strategy which alters them, the give and take, they can get congealed, become firmly set. So, in a sense, what was happening in the childcare system was a competition for dominance, a competition to set up the relationship of influence and influenceability in a particular way that was rigid. Now, when we have this in organizations, when we have it in society, you get domination because the right to influence, if we can put it in that way, gets set in stone, and you are a hair's whisker away from enslavement of one group by another group. Now, I'm using this language because I just want to reconnect back with what I said at the beginning about Gestalt's dream of freedom. So, this is the point. Our contribution to organising as a Gestalt community is a dynamic form of figure and ground in ongoing relationship. Our way towards a unique offering is to take this seriously. To take this seriously, we need to notice the different shape of figure and ground and acknowledge both. The ground is shaped by slow accumulations and normative behaviour. The ground supplies a setting towards which we are inclined to comply, a norm. It stands for the impersonal continuity of organisations, indeed for any structure of human relationship. The emphasis on normativity and continuity is in contrast with the emphasis in figure formation on awareness, judgment and choice. Figure, by this understanding, is an abstract reference, as I've said, to the self-determination of people, their ability to create their own destiny and to shape the patterns that seek to rule them from the background, by asserting an ideal of contact with the immediacy of the present. It is, of course, very different from the sort of analysis that we are seeing when we talk about the ground. Then the perspective is how humans are part of something that is being progressively instituted. Instead of focusing on the constitution of individual realities, the ground focuses on the institution of history, of contact. What we have with Gestalt form is a refusal to accept the complete polarization of these very different ways. What we have with the Gestalt form is a theory that puts these two parts into a dynamic relationship where each one informs the other to the benefit of each other part, and through that benefit to the benefit of the whole, which is more than the sum of those parts. That is the theoretical construct which I think we have to offer, which is unique. Where we go next? I talked earlier about feeling and about feeling one's way into a situation. Feeling one's way into a situation is a very active aspect of attending. Okay? It's, if you think about it as an organism, the organism is feeling its way into contact. Now, the idea of practice, crosses the boundary between figure and ground. Practice comes from custom, comes from a tradition, comes from a community of practitioners. it is then delivered by figural action. So the ground flows into the individual delivery of practice. So I'm very interested in what are the practices that sustain the integrity of the ground and of the figure. And that is the place to go next. I expect to find that many of those practices are a reaffirmation of what we already do. I can think of attention, for example, and learning. But then we may also find there are some practices which go in a slightly different direction, and those we will also have to focus on. Thank you. I hope to hear from you, and I hope some of you